women's suffrage movement was a pivotal chapter in the history of women's rights, centered around the fight for women's right to vote. Spanning more than 7 decades, this movement fundamentally reshaped societies across the world, particularly in the United States, the United Kingdom, and other Western nations. The struggle for women's suffrage was not just about gaining the vote. It was about challenging centuries-old traditions and inequalities that kept women from enjoying full citizenship and participation in public life. The roots of the women's suffrage movement can be traced back to the early 19th century, when the broader movement for women's rights began to take shape. Women in both the US and Europe started advocating for equal rights in areas such as education, property ownership, and employment. However, the right to vote soon became the central demand, as it was seen as a key to unlocking broader political and social equality. One of the earliest and most important events in the suffrage movement was the Seneca Falls Convention, held in New York in 1848. Organized by prominent activists Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, this gathering marked the first formal push for women's rights in the United States. The convention produced the Declaration of Sentiments, a document modeled after the Declaration of Independence, which declared that all men and women are created equal. It outlined a series of grievances against the systemic exclusion of women from political and social rights, with the right to vote as one of the key demands. Over the following decades, the women's suffrage movement gained momentum as more women began to demand equal voting rights. Leaders like Susan B. Anthony, Sojourner Truth, and Carrie Chapman Catt played vital roles in organizing rallies, giving speeches, and lobbying politicians. These women faced fierce opposition from both men and women who believed that women should remain in the domestic sphere. Despite this, the suffragists remained determined and continued to press for change. By the late 19th century, 2 major suffrage organizations had emerged in the United States. The National Woman Suffrage Association, NWSA, led by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, and the American Woman Suffrage Association, AWSA, led by Lucy Stone and Henry Blackwell. While both groups sought the right to vote, they differed in their strategies. The NWSA focused on achieving a federal amendment to the U.S. Constitution, while the AWSA aimed to secure the vote state by state. In 1890, the 2 groups merged to form the National American Woman Suffrage Association, NWSA, uniting their efforts toward a common goal. The suffrage movement in the United Kingdom also gained traction in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Emmeline Pankhurst and her daughters Christabel and Sylvia led the British movement, founding the Women's Social and Political Union, WSPU, in 1903. Known for their militant tactics, the Pankhursts and their supporters engaged in acts of civil disobedience, such as hunger strikes, chaining themselves to government buildings, and even breaking windows to draw attention to their cause. The British suffragettes, as they were known, faced imprisonment, police violence, and public scorn, but their determination helped push the issue of women's suffrage to the forefront of national debate. World War I was a turning point in both the American and British suffrage movements. As men went off to fight, women stepped into roles traditionally held by men, proving their capability in the workforce, public service, and industry. Their contributions to the war effort helped to shift public opinion in favor of women's right to vote. In the UK, the Representation of the People Act was passed in 1918, granting voting rights to women over the age of 30 who met certain property qualifications. 10 years later, the Equal Franchise Act of 1928 extended the vote to all women over 21, giving them the same voting rights as men. In the United States, the women's suffrage movement was a pivotal chapter in the history of women's rights, centered around the fight for women's right to vote.